we are stepping quietly into the forgotten corners of the Middle Ages, into a world that rarely makes it into the pages of history books. While knights, kings, and battles dominate most stories of this time, there were countless lives lived far from glory, far from swords clashing and banners flying. Tonight, you will meet Thomas, a medieval castle guard whose days were defined not by heroism, but by waiting. And in that waiting, we will see a history that almost nobody remembers. The castle he served stood in a quiet stretch of northern England, its gray stone walls weathered by centuries of wind and rain. It was 1287, a year that seemed ordinary in the records. Yet for Thomas, each day held a rhythm so monotonous that it became both a comfort and a challenge. The morning fog would creep across the fields, curling around the base of the walls, and Thomas would climb the narrow steps to his post at the top of the tower. He was not young anymore. His shoulders were heavy from years of leaning over battlements, scanning the horizon for threats that rarely came. Most mornings, he would see only fields stretching into a distant haze, the occasional peasant walking along dirt paths, perhaps heading toward the village market. Birds flitted across the sky, indifferent to human schedules and the weight of duty. Thomas watched them, their carefree movements a stark contrast to his own rigid routine. Life in the castle was a series of small rituals. The garrison had its routines. The men would eat cold bread and cheese for breakfast, and sometimes porridge if the cook was generous that day. Meals were quiet, conversation sparse. Thomas often found himself eating in silence, staring at the wall ahead, imagining the world beyond it. He had heard tales from traders passing through the castle gates, stories of distant towns, strange lands, and unusual customs. Yet he rarely ventured beyond the castle's walls. His fellow guards were as ordinary as he was. None dreamed of glory or fame. Some napped in the sun during the long afternoon hours. Others polished their armor until it gleamed, though battles seldom demanded it. Thomas often wondered about the people they protected, wealthy lords and ladies whose lives were filled with feasts, music, and chatter. He served them quietly, a silent presence among the stone and mortar, a shadow that observed more than it acted. The work was lonely, but not entirely unpleasant. In the evenings, the setting sun would cast long shadows across the courtyard, turning the simple stones into an intricate pattern of light and dark. Thomas sometimes traced these shadows with his eyes, imagining stories in their shapes. One evening, he spotted a fox slinking along the perimeter of the castle, its orange coat glowing in the fading light. He smiled at its audacity, its ability to move freely in a world bound by walls and expectations. One of the most tedious parts of his day was the inspection of the armory. Thomas had to count swords, spears, and arrows meticulously, ensuring nothing was missing. The work required attention but little thought. Yet, as he arranged the weapons, he imagined the soldiers who would use them in the rare moments of conflict. He wondered if they too felt the weight of time pressing upon them, if they too noticed the quiet things, like the way light hit the stones or the distant murmur of a brook. As night fell, the castle settled into a profound silence. The torches flickered, casting shadows that danced across walls and corridors. Thomas would take his position once more, his eyes straining to see any sign of movement beyond the walls. Sometimes the wind would whistle through the arrow slits, carrying distant sounds of animals or the rustling of leaves. These sounds, though faint, reminded him that the world continued outside the stone confines, a world that moved on even as his life seemed paused. Despite the apparent dullness, Thomas's days were filled with subtle stories. Each creak of a wooden door, each distant shout from the village, each call of a night bird became part of a tapestry he alone could perceive. His mind, trained to notice threats, also became attuned to small wonders. He knew the rhythm of the seasons, the pattern of the clouds, and even the unique way a certain raven would circle the castle every morning. He often thought about the messengers who came and went. They brought news, sometimes trivial, sometimes important. One day, a courier arrived with a letter sealed in wax, a rare event that caused a ripple of curiosity among the guards. Thomas carefully observed the seal, noting its emblem. It belonged to a nearby lord, a man known for both generosity and strictness. Even in such small encounters, Thomas found stories, quiet lessons in duty, observation, and patience. In this world, waiting was a skill, almost a discipline. The guards learned to observe, to endure, to find meaning in the ordinary. Thomas reflected on how little the rest of the world appreciated such moments. People remembered battles, conquests, feasts, and festivals, but the silent hours, when life seemed to stand still and yet quietly shift, were often forgotten. And as Thomas climbed down the tower steps one last time for the night, he paused at the courtyard. The moon had risen, pale and steady, illuminating the castle's walls. He inhaled the cool night air, feeling it fill his lungs, feeling the calm spread through his body. Each day had ended as it had begun, quietly, predictably, but also with a rhythm and a texture all its own. He walked toward the small keep, his steps echoing against the stone. Inside, the fire in the hearth glowed warmly. The cook had prepared a simple stew, enough to warm him, but not to delight. Thomas ate slowly, savoring the flavors that reminded him that even in a life defined by routine, there were moments of comfort. Tonight, as he lay on his straw-filled mattress, listening to the distant call of an owl and the occasional clatter of the kitchen, Thomas drifted into sleep. Tomorrow, he would climb the tower once again, resume his watch, and find the subtle patterns and stories hidden in the quiet hours. For in the life of a medieval guard, even waiting was a form of history, waiting patiently while the world spun around him. And this was just the beginning of Thomas's story, a story of quiet observation, of unnoticed details, and of a medieval world that rarely shows itself to those who read only the grand tales. Morning came slowly over the castle, with light filtering through the narrow arrow slits and painting long lines on the cold stone floor. Thomas stirred from his sleep, the straw mattress beneath him stiff and uncomfortable, but familiar enough to welcome him back into wakefulness. He rose quietly, careful not to disturb the other guards, who still slumbered, their breathing slow, and even in the early hours. By the time he had washed his face with water from the basin near the hearth, the first murmurs of activity had begun elsewhere in the castle. The cook clanged pots and pans, preparing a modest breakfast, while the young pages hurried about, carrying messages and tidying small corners that only they seemed to notice. Thomas observed them with his usual patience, noting the slight tilt of a boy's cap or the way he balanced a tray of bread. These small details, seemingly insignificant, were what Thomas remembered most vividly. In a life of waiting, observation became a kind of art. He climbed the stairs to his post once again, the cold stone steps pressing against his bare feet. The sky was pale with the promise of day, and a light wind stirred the banners that hung from the battlements. He tightened the straps of his leather jerkin and lifted his halberd, feeling its familiar weight in his hands. Every morning brought a slight sense of anticipation, not because he expected a battle or an attack, but because the hours spent watching and waiting offered a rhythm he had grown to rely on. As he leaned against the parapet, gazing out over the fields and distant forests, he noticed the patterns of movement below. Farmers had begun their work, tending to livestock or plowing fields, and the occasional cart rattled along a dirt path, the wheels groaning under the weight of hay. He had learned to read these patterns, understanding who was traveling where and why, even without interacting with them. Observation, he realized, was a way of connecting with the world beyond the walls, a quiet dialogue with life that continued outside his tower. By mid-morning, Thomas's thoughts wandered to the castle's inner workings. The lords and ladies rarely left their private chambers, moving about only to attend brief meetings, meals, or religious services. The corridors were filled with faint echoes of whispered conversations and the clinking of armor being polished. But beyond that, the castle itself seemed to exist in a timeless state. He often pondered how the lives of the elite, so rigidly structured and insulated, contrasted sharply with the simplicity of the peasants in the fields, or the traders who passed through the village gates. Yet both were part of the same story, connected by invisible threads of duty, labor, and expectation. The first visitors of the day arrived just after mid-morning. Merchants from nearby villages brought their wares, coarse cloth, dried herbs, and occasionally something exotic, like a jar of preserved fruit or a small piece of foreign metalwork. Thomas watched them carefully, noting not only the goods, but the expressions on their faces, the way they bowed, and the careful negotiation of space with the guards. Each encounter, no matter how brief, offered lessons in human nature, in patience and attention, and in the quiet understanding that life did not always require action to be meaningful. Around midday, Thomas was joined by another guard, Peter, a younger man who had recently been assigned to the castle. Peter was eager and talkative, asking questions about the routines, the history of the fortress, and the habits of those who lived within its walls. Thomas responded patiently, recounting stories not of battles won or enemies slain, but of the small, often overlooked aspects of castle life. The way the wind changed in the courtyard depending on the season, how certain stones grew slick after rain, or the habits of the resident animals, from the cats in the kitchens to the owls nesting near the towers. Peter listened intently, absorbing details that seemed mundane. Yet Thomas knew that in time, these observations would shape the younger man's perception of the world around him. Lunch was a simple affair: bread, cheese, and perhaps some salted meat if the cook felt generous. They ate in silence, watching a pair of children from the village peek over the walls, attempting to see the interior of the castle. Thomas remembered doing the same as a boy, his curiosity about life beyond the stone barriers always burning. He smiled quietly, recalling the small triumphs of youth and the way imagination could transform the ordinary into something remarkable. The afternoon brought a slow shift in the castle's energy. Sunlight streamed through narrow windows, warming the stone walls and casting intricate shadows across corridors and stairwells. Thomas resumed his watch atop the tower, scanning the horizon with meticulous attention. Clouds drifted lazily, and he noted subtle changes in the wind, the direction of birds flying, and the occasional flicker of smoke rising from distant chimneys. These observations were his way of participating in the rhythm of life, a silent acknowledgement that the world continued beyond the castle's walls, indifferent to the passage of time within them. An unexpected commotion arrived late in the afternoon. A messenger, riding a tired but swift horse, approached the gates carrying news from a neighboring lord. The seal on the letter was unfamiliar, and Thomas felt a spark of curiosity. He descended to meet the messenger, observing the urgency in the rider's eyes and the precise way he held the reins. The letter contained instructions for a meeting of minor lords, a minor event in the larger scope of the kingdom. Yet for Thomas, it provided a glimpse into the mechanics of power and communication, an understanding of how decisions were conveyed across distances in a world without modern conveniences. By evening, the castle had returned to its familiar rhythm. Guards patrolled corridors, the cook prepared a modest stew, and the torches were lit one by one, flickering shadows along the walls. Thomas reflected on the day as he climbed the tower again, feeling the weight of his halberd and the cool stone beneath his hands. Each day, though outwardly similar, brought subtle variations, a new pattern in the wind, a different arrangement of clouds, or a fleeting expression on a passerby's face. It was these small differences that gave texture to his existence, that made each day distinct despite its apparent monotony. Night fell gently, enveloping the castle in darkness. Thomas listened to the occasional howl of a distant wolf and the murmur of the wind. He contemplated the lives he observed from afar, the rhythm of duty that structured the day. quiet satisfaction that came from mastering patience and observation. The castle itself seemed alive in these hours, each stone and timber a witness to centuries of lives, lived quietly, dutifully, and with unnoticed grace. As he lay down on his straw-filled mattress once more, Thomas felt the continuity of time pressing around him. He had observed, he had waited, he had noticed details others overlooked. These were not heroic acts, but they were the pulse of everyday life, the heartbeat of a medieval world rarely remembered. And tomorrow, he would rise again, climb the tower, and continue his watch, discovering once more the subtle stories hidden in plain sight. The morning mist lingered low over the castle walls, clinging to the stone like a thin, ghostly veil. Thomas awoke with a quiet sense of anticipation, not because anything extraordinary was expected, but because each day offered subtle shifts that could change the rhythm of his watch. He rose carefully from his straw mattress, stretching his stiff limbs and listening to the soft creak of wooden beams above. The castle was slowly coming to life, though in these early hours it felt suspended between night and day, neither fully awake nor completely at rest. By the time he reached the battlements, the sky had begun to brighten in streaks of pale gold and soft lavender. The distant hills and forests seemed muted, almost ethereal, as the sunlight touched the land for the first time. Thomas adjusted his halberd strap across his shoulder, inhaling the crisp air, nodding the scent of damp earth and pine carried by the wind. There was a rhythm to the world outside the walls that he had come to recognize. The rise and fall of bird calls, the creaking of a cartwheel along the village road, the faint murmur of a stream moving through reeds. His first task was a routine inspection of the battlements and towers. Each stone, each iron bracket, each wooden beam was a small testament to time and human effort. He traced his hand along rough edges worn smooth by decades of wind and rain, marveling at the craftsmanship that endured despite the centuries. For Thomas, there was a sense of connection with those who had come before him. Their labor, their vigilance, and their quiet determination were woven into every corner of the fortress. Below, in the castle courtyard, life had begun in earnest. Servants hurried between kitchens and storerooms, balancing baskets of bread and supplies, while the castle smiths pounded iron in rhythmic bursts that resonated through the walls. Thomas watched these movements with a patient gaze, understanding that even the smallest act of labor contributed to the life of the fortress. Each footstep, each motion, each whispered conversation formed an invisible web, connecting the work of the many to the safety and stability of the whole. By mid-morning, he had been joined by Peter, who had grown increasingly eager to absorb Thomas's observations. Peter asked questions about the castle's defenses, the signaling systems, and the placement of battlements. Thomas responded with patience, recounting details often overlooked by the untrained eye. The way a flag's angle could indicate the wind direction, the subtle cracks in the masonry that hinted at structural weakness, the faint marks on the stones left by centuries of rainwater. Each lesson was practical, yet it also carried an underlying sense of history, the knowledge that the world had been shaped incrementally by countless hands, and that each moment, though ordinary, contributed to the continuity of life. The castle kitchens released a mouth-watering aroma around midday. Fresh bread baking in the stone oven, a thick stew simmering over a roaring fire, and herbs drying on wooden racks. Thomas allowed himself a brief respite, sitting on a bench near the courtyard while observing the kitchen staff's coordinated efforts. The way they moved, each gesture measured and purposeful, reminded him that even in the simplest acts there was art, a form of elegance born from necessity and routine. He reflected on how much of life consisted not of grand events, but of careful, consistent labor performed over countless hours. News from the surrounding villages began to arrive late in the afternoon. Messengers brought letters sealed with unfamiliar insignias, and a few villagers arrived seeking permission to sell or trade goods. Thomas, ever attentive, noted each arrival, the posture of the messenger, the clink of coin in the villager's purse, the wear of boots from long travel. He could tell, often before a word was spoken, who carried urgency in their heart and who moved merely out of habit. It was a skill honed over years of observation, an unspoken language written in gestures and expressions. As the sun dipped lower, the light in the castle transformed. Shadows stretched along corridors and stairwells, shifting with a slowness that Thomas found comforting. He climbed the tower once again, feeling the weight of his halberd in his hands. The courtyard below buzzed faintly with activity as families returned from the fields and traders closed their stalls. Thomas took note of each subtle chain, the soft clatter of a cart settling in the yard, the whisper of a child's laughter carried by the wind, the flutter of a bird landing on a windowsill. These details, minute and often unnoticed, were the texture of his days, and he recorded them carefully in the mental ledger of his mind. Night approached gradually, bringing with it a cool breeze that swept through the towers. The torches were lit, their flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows on stone walls that had seen centuries pass quietly. Thomas reflected on the continuity of the castle, the lives that intersected within its walls, and the silent passage of time marked not by battles, but by patience and routine. The ordinary, he realized, contained its own kind of significance, a life quietly observed, understood, and preserved in memory. Before retiring to his quarters, Thomas took a final walk along the outer battlements. The stars began to emerge one by one, and he traced constellations he had learned from old pages kept in the library. The night was still, the only sound the distant murmur of the village and the occasional owl. He thought of the world beyond the castle walls and of the subtle ways in which lives intersected. Though his own story seemed small, even mundane, it was entwined with countless others. A silent testament to the rhythm of the medieval world. Finally, as he lay upon his straw mattress, Thomas allowed his thoughts to drift. The day had offered no spectacle, no grand moment of heroism, yet it had been full of lessons about observation, patience, and the quiet power of noticing what others overlook. Tomorrow would come, and with it another cycle of ordinary moments, each waiting to be discovered, each carrying the weight of human experience in its silent, unremarkable way. Morning broke slowly over the castle, spilling pale light across the ramparts and the cobbled courtyard below. Thomas rose from his straw mattress, stretching his stiff arms and noticing the familiar scent of damp stone and burning torches that lingered from the night. Though the world beyond the walls awoke with the chatter of villagers and the crowing of roosters, the castle had its own measured rhythm, almost independent of the outside world. Each sound, each movement, was catalogued in Thomas's mind, like a record of life, unfolding quietly, steadily, and unnoticed, made his way to the outer battlements, where the cool air carried hints of smoke from the kitchens below, and the distant smell of tilled soil from the fields. The horizon glowed faintly with gold, signaling the sun's slow ascent. From this vantage, Thomas could see the village stretching outward in an irregular pattern, fields dotted with thatched huts and small gardens. The wind shifted slightly, rustling the banners that hung from the towers, and he adjusted his cloak, feeling the texture of the wool against his skin. Thomas's first duty of the day was to examine the castle gates. He descended the narrow stone stairwell leading to the main entrance, knotting the worn grooves in the stone where carts had passed for decades. The iron portcullis had been oiled the night before, but Thomas ran his hand along its surface, checking for signs of rust or stress. A minor crack along the edge of the gate caught his attention, almost imperceptible, yet potentially troublesome if left unmonitored. He made a mental note to mention it to the master mason when the day's routine allowed. Below the walls, the castle courtyard had begun to buzz with activity. The blacksmith's hammer rang out in regular cadence, echoing off stone walls and reaching even the highest towers. Servants hurried between storerooms and kitchens, balancing crates of supplies with practiced ease. Children, under the watchful eyes of a few older siblings, ran between stalls, their laughter mingling with the calls of vendors preparing for trade. Thomas observed it all with meticulous attention, his mind noting details invisible to most. The angle of a worker's step, the tension in a cartwheel axle, the faint aroma of herbs drying on racks near the kitchen entrance. By mid-morning, Thomas encountered Sir Edmund, the castle steward, near the granary. Sir Edmund was a tall man with a stern gaze, his tunic adorned with the family crest, and he carried a ledger filled with notes on the day's provisions. They exchanged greetings, brief and courteous, before delving into the work of inventory. Thomas followed him through the storage rooms, noting sacks of grain stacked carefully, barrels of salted meat, and containers of dried fruits and legumes. Each item was crucial. The castle's survival depended on careful management of these stores. As he moved through the granary, Thomas reflected on how much of medieval life relied on preparation and routine, on the quiet diligence of those unseen. A sudden clatter from the stables drew his attention. Horses, some restless in their stalls, whinnied and stamped. The stable hands moved quickly, soothing animals and cleaning stalls. Thomas approached, noting the condition of the animals, their coats shiny from grooming, their hooves checked and tended. One horse shifted nervously, and Thomas gently placed a hand on its flank, calming it with a quiet, deliberate presence. In these small interactions, he found a strange sense of connection, not just to the animals, but to the people whose labor ensured their well-being. Every task, no matter how mundane, was part of a larger rhythm of life. By late morning, messengers arrived from nearby villages, bringing requests for supplies and occasional news. Thomas observed the interaction carefully. The posture of the messenger, the sound of the leather satchel, the careful manner in which the letters were handed over. He noticed a young man clutching a bundle of letters, his hands trembling slightly, betraying either nervousness or anticipation. Thomas listened to the steward as he read each note aloud, disseminating instructions efficiently, while Thomas cataloged the information for himself, noting what would require attention later in the day. Lunchtime in the castle was a quiet affair compared to the bustling morning hours. Thomas found a bench near the outer wall, leaning on his halberd as he observed the midday scene. He watched the cooks move with methodical precision, stirring soups, kneading dough, and arranging simple meals for the guards and servants. The aroma of baking bread mixed with roasted vegetables filled the air, a comforting reminder of the routines that defined life within the walls. Thomas took a small piece of bread and a chunk of cheese, eating slowly while reflecting on the small, interconnected acts that kept the castle functioning. As afternoon approached, Thomas made his rounds along the inner walls, checking arrow slits, parapets, and hidden stairways. He ran his hand along the stone surfaces, feeling the texture of centuries-old masonry. A faint crack in one corner caught his attention, where water had seeped in during a recent rainstorm. He traced the line carefully, mentally noting its potential implications and the measures that might prevent further deterioration. Each observation was recorded in his mind, a mental catalog of the castle's integrity, and the knowledge that his vigilance mattered, even if only in subtle, incremental ways. A sudden wind gust brought the smell of smoke from the forge below. Thomas paused, inhaling deeply. The blacksmith's rhythm was steady and unbroken, yet the faint odor of smoldering coals reminded him that danger was always nearby if ignored. He checked the placement of firewood, the flammable materials stored near the workshop, and the position of water buckets. Small preventive measures mattered immensely, and though the day seemed ordinary, each of these details was a quiet battle against potential disaster. As evening approached, shadows lengthened across across the battlements. The sun, low in the sky, cast a warm glow over the courtyard. Families returned from the fields, carrying baskets of produce and tending to small chores. The children's laughter rang out faintly as they played near the stables. Thomas watched, noting the subtle movements, the gentle sway of laundry drying in the breeze, the flicker of candlelight from kitchen windows, and the faint sound of conversation carried up from below. Each of these details, though small, contributed to the living tapestry of the castle and its surrounding lands. Nightfall arrived, bringing a stillness that contrasted sharply with the day's subtle bustle. Thomas walked along the outer walls one last time, gazing out at the village and the distant hills. The stars began to emerge in the clear sky, their constellations familiar and comforting. A cool breeze whispered through the towers, rustling banners and the leaves of nearby trees. Thomas paused, reflecting on the quiet significance of each ordinary day. Even in the absence of grand events, there was meaning in vigilance, in attention, and in the careful observation of life's minutiae. Returning to his quarters, Thomas settled on his straw mattress, letting the quiet seep into him. His body ached slightly from the day's routine, yet there was satisfaction in the knowledge that he had observed, recorded, and maintained the castle's rhythm. Each moment, though mundane, was essential. And though the world beyond these walls might consider such tasks insignificant, Thomas knew that history itself was often built upon the quiet diligence of ordinary lives. With the torches flickering and the night fully enveloping the castle, Thomas allowed his mind to drift. He thought of the days to come, the unnoticed events that would quietly shape the story of the fortress, and the ways in which small acts of care and attention could ripple through time. Sleep gradually claimed him, a soft reprieve after hours spent attentive to every stone, every sound, and every movement within the castle walls. The dawn crept over the horizon with a faint pink hue, illuminating the castle's towers in soft, diffused light. Thomas awoke to the familiar sensation of damp stone beneath his feet as he slid from the straw mattress, careful not to disturb the sleeping guard beside him. The air was cool and carried a subtle scent of dew mixed with the lingering smoke from last night's torches. For Thomas, the castle in the early hours held a particular kind of serenity, one that allowed him to observe minutiae unnoticed by the more hurried or impatient eyes of others. He dressed quickly, pulling on his woolen tunic and securing his belt. The quiet of the morning was broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden beams and the distant lowing of a cow from the village below. Thomas moved to the battlements, halberd in hand, and looked across the valley. The mist hung low over the fields, curling around hedgerows and small cottages. In the distance, he could see smoke rising from the chimneys, marking the beginning of another day for the villagers. Every morning offered the same view, yet each held subtle differences: the angle of sunlight, the movement of clouds, the patterns of labor below. Thomas found fascination in these small changes, recording them mentally with meticulous care. His first task was to inspect the castle's water supply. He descended the spiral staircase leading to the cistern, noting the dampness that clung to the walls. The water level appeared stable, yet Thomas checked each plank and seal, gently tapping them to ensure there were no hidden leaks. Even minor cracks could compromise the cistern, and the safety of the castle depended on vigilance. While inspecting, he noticed a faint greenish tinge near the stone lining, suggesting the early growth of algae. He marked this for later cleaning, understanding that small preventative measures prevented future headaches. By mid-morning, Thomas joined the other guards for a brief assembly in the courtyard. The steward, Sir Edmund, handed out daily instructions, and Thomas listened carefully, noting who would be stationed where, what supplies needed monitoring, and which gates required special attention due to increased activity. Thomas's mind processed each detail, cross-referencing it with his own observations from the previous day. He would follow the routine, but remain alert for any anomalies, however minor. The castle kitchens had already begun to hum with activity. The scent of baking bread, roasted onions, and herbs filled the air. Thomas paused briefly to watch a cook kneading dough, the rhythmic motions almost hypnotic. He observed the way flour dusted the floor, how each loaf was scored before being placed in the oven, and how the assistants worked in tandem to ensure efficiency. Every movement was a part of a larger, precise pattern, and Thomas admired the quiet coordination, so necessary yet so easily overlooked by those outside these stone walls. Afterward, Thomas patrolled the storage rooms and armory. He ran his hands over the polished handles of spears and halberds, checking for signs of wear or rust. The armory was a space of discipline and care. Each weapon had a place, each helmet a specific shelf. Thomas noted the condition of the leather straps and padding in the armor, imagining how they would hold up in the event of conflict. Though the castle had not faced attack in years, preparation never ceased. He understood the value of readiness and the silent reassurance it brought to all who resided here. In the late morning, a small group of villagers arrived to deliver supplies. Thomas observed as they carefully balanced baskets of vegetables, eggs, and freshly baked bread. He watched the young boys' clumsy steps, the mothers' wary glances, and the faint nervousness in their movements, suggesting their awareness of the castle's authority. Thomas took mental note of each person, not out of suspicion, but to understand the patterns and relationships that governed daily interactions. Every exchange, every gesture, contributed to the living rhythm of the castle and village life. Lunch was modest, yet satisfying. Thomas ate quietly near the courtyard wall, sharing a simple meal of bread, cheese, and stewed vegetables with two fellow guards. They spoke little, letting the sounds of the day, the blacksmith's hammer, the clatter of carts, the occasional bird call, fill the silence. Thomas preferred these quiet moments. They allowed him to reflect on the morning's duties and plan the afternoon's rounds. Each detail he remembered: how the sun had glinted off the iron hinges, how the scent of herbs lingered near the kitchens, how the children had paused their games for a brief bow when seeing the guards was a fragment of the living history he absorbed daily. The afternoon brought a surprise. A traveler, clad in simple garments, arrived at the gates, requesting permission to enter the castle. Thomas observed carefully as the steward evaluated the man's intentions. The traveler seemed nervous yet earnest, speaking quickly but politely. Thomas noted the tone of his voice, the slight tremor in his hands, and the alignment of his eyes as he avoided direct gaze. The steward allowed brief passage into the courtyard, and Thomas watched as the traveler was guided to the guest chamber, noting the efficiency with which every detail was managed. It was a reminder that even unexpected events followed a quiet, predictable logic within the castle's walls. Later, Thomas ascended the outer wall to survey the surrounding countryside. The fields were alive with activity. Peasants worked in lines, their scythes moving in rhythm, their baskets gathering produce. A group of children chased a dog near the edge of the forest, their laughter carried on the breeze. Thomas's eyes traced the horizon, observing the distant hills and the winding paths leading to other settlements. He understood that the castle was a nexus, a center from which the surrounding lands were organized and maintained. And he felt a quiet pride in his part in this vast, interconnected system. As dusk approached, Thomas returned to his post near the main gate. He noticed a minor disturbance. 2 chickens had escaped from a pen and wandered near the guardhouse. While seemingly trivial, he watched how the guards managed the situation, how the villagers responded with mild amusement, and how the animals were gently guided back. Even small incidents revealed human behavior, social hierarchy, and the subtleties of authority, and Thomas absorbed it all with keen interest. Nightfall fell gradually, cloaking the castle in shadow. Torches were lit along the walls, and the courtyard grew quiet. Thomas completed his final rounds, checking the battlements, gate mechanisms, and guard rotations. Each step, each touch, each glance was an exercise in care, a reassurance that all was as it should be. He paused briefly at the edge of the rampart, looking over the moonlit fields, reflecting on how small, unnoticed actions formed the foundation of life within the castle walls. The rhythm of vigilance continued even in the quiet hours. Returning to his quarters, Thomas removed his gear and settled onto the straw mattress. He thought back over the day, the patterns observed, the small surprises, the routine care, and the silent satisfaction of work done well. Outside, the village lights twinkled faintly, the sounds of distant animals and the soft murmur of human activity providing a lullaby for the weary guard. Thomas closed his eyes, letting sleep claim him, knowing that tomorrow would bring another day of observation, quiet labor, and the subtle unfolding of life within these ancient stone walls. The morning air was cool and carried the distant scent of wood smoke as Thomas rose from his straw bedding. The sounds of the castle waking creaking doors, the shuffle of boots along stone floors, the faint clang of the blacksmith's hammer filled the air, marking the rhythm of a new day. Thomas ran his fingers over the rough walls of his chamber before pulling on his tunic, adjusting the leather strap of his belt, and slipping his halberd into its worn sheath. The stone floor was cold beneath his bare feet, and the chill reminded him to keep alert. Even in the quiet, dangers could lurk unnoticed. He moved quickly to the battlements, scanning the horizon. Mist clung to the edges of the valley, winding among the fields and cottages like pale smoke. Thomas's eyes followed the paths and lanes, noting movements in the village below, the slow procession of a milkmaid carrying pails, a group of children chasing one another along the uneven cobblestones, a cart being guided by a tired ox. Every detail was observed and catalogued. Even the smallest deviation from routine could reveal something about the world he guarded. By mid-morning, Thomas had descended to inspect the stables. Horses neighed softly as he entered, their hooves clattering on the stone floor. He checked each stall carefully, rubbing the animals' coats, feeling for signs of fatigue or illness. The blacksmith's apprentice approached to deliver a small set of new horseshoes. Thomas examined them, noting the evenness of the iron, the slight curve needed for the older mare, and the craftsmanship required to ensure they would endure long journeys. Small tasks such as these were mundane, yet they contributed to the smooth functioning of the castle and its defenses. Later, Thomas joined the other guards for a routine inspection of the outer walls. He walked slowly, halberd in hand, observing every corner, every arrow slit, every rope and pulley. The castle had not faced an attack in many years, yet discipline required constant vigilance. A loose stone in the parapet caught his eye. He tapped it with his boot, ensuring it was secure. A minor defect, perhaps, but one that could worsen over time. Thomas mentally recorded it, planning to notify the steward before the day ended. In the courtyard, the kitchens were alive with activity. The smell of freshly baked bread mingled with roasting onions and herbs. Thomas paused to watch the bakers, noting the coordination of hands, the rhythm of movement, the subtle cues each cook gave another. Even in the mundane act of preparing meals, there was an elegance in precision, an order that reflected the larger discipline of castle life. He appreciated the quiet efficiency, often unnoticed by those who only saw the final product. Midday brought a brief respite as Thomas ate near the inner gate, breaking bread with his companions in quiet conversation. They spoke of trivial matters, the weather, rumors from the nearby villages, and minor squabbles among farmhands. Thomas listened more than he spoke, using the opportunity to observe gestures, tone, and expressions. Every small interaction revealed the structure and rhythm of human behavior within the castle. Even minor details, the way a man adjusted his tunic or a child lowered his gaze, added to Thomas's understanding of the social fabric he existed within. An unusual commotion arose in the afternoon. A hawk had somehow entered the courtyard, flapping and squawking, startling a group of servants. Thomas moved calmly, guiding the bird toward an open window, using steady hands and careful motions. Watching the reactions of those around him, he noted the subtle ways fear, surprise, and relief manifested in each individual. The incident was brief, yet it provided insight into human responses to the unexpected, a lesson as valuable as any drill or inspection. As the day progressed, Thomas patrolled the battlements again, this time focusing on the surrounding landscape. He observed a small river winding through the valley, glinting under the sun, the water carrying reflections of clouds and trees. Farmers worked their fields with careful persistence, their labor unhurried yet methodical. A group of children played near the riverbank, their laughter carrying faintly on the breeze. The symmetry of life, even in its chaos, was evident to Thomas. Patterns, routines, and small moments of unpredictability interwoven in a delicate balance. Evening arrived, and with it, the ritual lighting of torches along the walls. Thomas checked the gates, ensuring all locks and mechanisms functioned smoothly. He lingered briefly at the edge of the outer wall, watching the sun sink behind distant hills, the sky painted in muted shades of orange and purple. The castle seemed to breathe with life, each stone, each timber a part of a quiet symphony. Thomas felt the satisfaction of another day concluded, each task completed, each observation recorded in his mind. Before retiring, Thomas visited the guest chamber, noting that the traveler from the previous day had prepared to leave. He observed the careful packing of belongings, the subtle bow of gratitude, and the respectful distance maintained by servants. Each gesture, no matter how small, spoke to the interconnectedness of those who lived and worked within the castle. The ordinary events of daily life, Thomas realized, were themselves extraordinary in their consistency and subtle complexity. Night fell fully, cloaking the castle in shadow. Thomas walked the final patrol along the walls, listening to the soft night noises, an owl calling in the distance, the faint rustle of leaves, the muted steps of other guards. He checked the gates one last time, ensuring they were secure. Returning to his quarters, Thomas removed his gear, lay on the straw mattress, and allowed his mind to wander over the day's events. Every minor detail, every small surprise, every routine task contributed to the living memory of the castle, and Thomas cherished it. Outside, the night was quiet, the village calm, and the stars stretched across the sky like pale fires. The dawn mist had lifted when Thomas rose again, his muscles still stiff from the previous day's patrols. The castle seemed quieter now, its stone walls bathed in the pale light of early morning. Thomas moved to the battlements without haste, his eyes scanning the distant hills. Smoke from village hearths curled upward in thin streams, and the river that cut through the valley gleamed faintly in the sunlight. Everything seemed peaceful, almost too peaceful, but Thomas knew that routine and vigilance were inseparable in a guard's life. He descended to the courtyard, where the smithy was already alive with sound. Hammers struck anvils with rhythmic precision, and the smell of molten metal mingled with the scent of fresh wood and clay. Thomas paused to inspect a set of arrowheads the apprentice had forged overnight. Each was carefully shaped, pointed, and balanced. He examined the curve, the weight, and the smoothness, noting which would fly truest. Even in seemingly mundane tasks, Thomas found lessons in attention and patience. By mid-morning, the castle gates required inspection. Thomas walked along the outer walls, checking the integrity of the iron bars, the condition of the hinges, and the alignment of the heavy wooden doors. A loose bracket caught his attention. Kneeling, he tapped it with his halberd and found it slightly worn. Another small detail to report, but one that mattered if the castle were ever tested. The rhythm of patrol, inspection, and observation formed the backbone of his day. A quiet melody repeated, yet never monotonous. In the inner yard, the kitchens were preparing a hearty midday meal. Thomas lingered, watching the cooks stir stews and knead bread, the smoke rising from hearths. He noted the synchronization between hands, the fluidity of movement, and the unspoken communication between them. Every meal prepared was a testament to the hidden labor that kept the castle functioning, and Thomas often marveled at the harmony in such mundane tasks. As the sun climbed higher, Thomas received word of a minor dispute in the village. Two farmers argued over a misplaced fence line. Thomas walked to the edge of the walls to observe, his eyes following the villagers as they gestured and spoke heatedly. He noted the tone of voice, the posture, the subtle shifts in stance. Resolving disputes required more than force. It required understanding, patience, and sometimes just presence. Even as a guard, Thomas found himself learning lessons in human nature. Afternoon brought the inspection of supplies. He checked the granaries and storage rooms, noting the weight of sacks, the presence of pests, and the rotation of food stores. Each observation, though unremarkable to outsiders, was crucial to the castle's ability to endure long winters or sieges. Thomas ran his hands over sacks of grain, feeling for dampness, listening for the quiet rustle of hidden insects. His diligence was a small but essential part of the larger system. Later, Thomas returned to the stables to check on the horses. The young foal that had startled him the previous week had grown slightly, its coat sleek and strong. He adjusted the halter, rubbed its mane, and ensured it was calm before moving on. Observing the animals, Thomas reflected on the parallels between human and animal behavior. Patience, routine, and respect formed the pillars of coexistence. Evening fell gently, and Thomas began the final patrol of the day. Torches flickered along the walls, casting shadows that danced over the stones. He noted the movement of the wind through the trees, the distant barking of dogs, and the rhythmic steps of his fellow guards. The castle seemed alive with quiet energy, every creak and murmur part of a larger, unseen orchestration. He paused at a corner turret, gazing out at the landscape where the village's lights twinkled like stars fallen to earth. Returning to his quarters, Thomas cleaned his halberd and straightened his tunic. The small routines that marked the end of the day gave him a sense of closure. He reflected on the events of the day, minor surprises, small insights, and the ongoing pattern of life within the walls. Every day was a thread woven into the fabric of the castle's memory, and Thomas took pride in his role as observer and participant. Before lying down, he looked out of the narrow window of his chamber. The sky darkened into deep indigo, punctuated by distant stars. A lone owl hooted somewhere nearby, and a soft breeze whispered across the battlements. Thomas closed his eyes, letting the sounds and smells of the castle linger. He knew tomorrow would bring the same rhythm, the same quiet revelations, the same small responsibilities. But that was the life he had chosen, and he found comfort in its steady, predictable flow. Morning arrived quietly over the castle, the sun spilling pale gold across the stone battlements. Thomas awoke with the familiar stiffness in his joints, a gentle reminder of yesterday's long patrols. Rising slowly, he stretched and listened to the castle come alive around him, the distant clang of the blacksmith, the soft murmur of the kitchen staff, and the occasional shout of a young page delivering messages across the courtyard. The rhythm of the castle was comforting in its predictability, and Thomas drew in a deep breath, the chill of the morning air filling his lungs. He descended to the courtyard where a new task awaited, inspecting the well and the surrounding cisterns. The castle relied heavily on these water sources, and any contamination could spell disaster. Kneeling beside the stone edge, Thomas peered into the clear water, noticing the faint ripple of fish and the soft reflection of the morning sky. A small leaf floated by, drifting in the current. He examined the pulley and rope mechanism, turning the crank carefully and checking the bucket for signs of wear. Even minor maintenance was vital. The smallest oversight could have consequences during a siege or a dry season. After ensuring the well was in proper order, Thomas made his way to the granary. He moved quietly among the sacks of grain, wheat, and dried legumes, listening to the faint creak of the floorboards. A slight rustle caught his attention, and he spotted a few small mice scuttling in the shadows. Pulling a small trap from his belt, he ensured the rodent population would remain controlled, not wanting the food stores compromised. He checked the seals on each sack, turning them gently, feeling for moisture, and nodding the rotation dates painted in white chalk. The castle's survival depended on these small, often unseen tasks, and Thomas's attention to detail made him indispensable. By late morning, the castle gates demanded another inspection. The gates were the first line of defense, and the point where the outside world touched the fortress. Thomas traced his hand along the wooden planks, feeling for warping or cracks. The iron reinforcements were polished, but the hinges required oiling. He worked quickly but methodically, applying a mixture of tallow and oil to prevent squeaks or rust. Observing the villagers in the courtyard below, he noticed a group of children attempting to mimic the guards' drills. Their laughter was bright against the quiet hum of duty, and Thomas allowed himself a small smile, remembering his own youth when the castle gates had seemed enormous and mysterious. The The afternoon brought Thomas to the armory, a dim, cool room smelling of iron, oil, and aged wood. He carefully examined each weapon: spears, halberds, swords, and bows. Every blade needed to be sharp, every joint solid. He lifted a sword, weighing it in his hands, testing its balance. It was heavier than the one he preferred for patrols, but serviceable. The apprentice beside him watched intently, learning the trade, and Thomas offered a few quiet words of advice. Balance and patience, not strength alone, will see you through battle. He found a strange satisfaction in these small moments of mentorship, understanding that even guards shaped the future by the way they handled their tools and trained others. Later, Thomas wandered toward the stables, where the scent of hay and horses filled the air. A mare had given birth overnight, and Thomas inspected the newborn foal carefully. Its legs were wobbly, its eyes bright and alert. He whispered softly to calm it, brushing its mane and checking its health. The life of the castle was a web of interdependence, and even these small animals played a critical role, carrying messages, patrolling the walls, and bearing supplies when needed. Each creature demanded care and observation, and Thomas found in them lessons of vigilance, patience, and responsibility. Evening crept over the battlements with a soft amber glow. Thomas conducted his final rounds, walking the walls and checking each corner turret. The torchlight flickered across the stone, casting shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. He paused at the tallest tower, gazing at the village below as lanterns lit homes one by one. The quiet murmurs of life in the valley below reminded him of the continuity and fragility of human endeavor. Every small act, inspection, patrol, observation, was a thread in the larger tapestry of the castle's survival. Returning to his chamber, Thomas took a moment to sharpen his halberd, the steady rasping sound echoing faintly in the quiet room. He straightened his tunic and arranged his belt, following the small routines that marked the end of the day. Through windows, he glimpsed the moonrise, a silver sliver above the distant hills. The soft night breeze carried with it the mingling scents of wood smoke, wet earth, and the lingering aroma of stew. Thomas lay down, closing his eyes, but keeping the sounds of the castle in his ears. Tomorrow would bring the same rhythms, the same quiet observations, but that was the life he had chosen, and he embraced it with steady resolve. Night had fallen over the castle, but Thomas remained vigilant. The moonlight washed silver across the stone walls, and a cool wind whispered through the battlements. Even when the courtyard was empty and the villagers had retreated to their homes, the castle itself seemed alive, the soft groan of timber settling, the distant drip of water from the cisterns, the occasional flutter of a bat skimming the ramparts. Thomas adjusted his cloak, letting it wrap snugly around him, and began his nightly patrol, the rhythmic sound of his boots echoing in the silence. He passed the kitchen, where the cook had left a small fire burning, embers glowing faintly in the hearth. The scent of yesterday's bread lingered, faintly sweet and comforting. Thomas allowed himself a small pause, running a hand along the stone wall beside him. The night was quiet, almost too quiet, and he knew that quiet was both a blessing and a risk. In these hours, vigilance was the difference between peace and disaster. Reaching the eastern wall, Thomas scanned the surrounding countryside. The farmland stretched into darkness, with only the occasional flicker of lanterns in distant cottages. He spotted a fox darting along the hedgerows, its amber eyes glinting briefly before disappearing. Thomas watched carefully. Animals often foretold more than one might expect movement that could hint at thieves or intruders, signs of the land's condition, or simply reminders of the untamed world beyond the stone walls. His next stop was the guardhouse, where a few younger guards were stationed. Thomas checked their positions, ensuring each had clear lines of sight and that the sentry posts were secure. He exchanged a few quiet words of guidance, reminding them to remain alert and observant. One of the apprentices carried a lantern, and the soft glow cast long, dancing shadows on the stone floors. Thomas's eyes followed the movement, noting gaps in coverage, the subtle angles of the walls, and how a shadow could conceal or reveal. Every detail mattered. Further along, Thomas approached the northern gate. The massive wooden doors creaked under the wind, and he inspected the iron fittings carefully, ensuring that rust had not weakened any bolts. He tested the latch, lifting the heavy bar, and confirmed it held fast. Behind the gate, the moat glistened faintly in the moonlight, reflecting the silhouette of the castle's towers. He traced the water's edge with his eyes, searching for any sign of unusual movement. Even a single misstep here could jeopardize the safety of everyone inside. The battlements led him to the central tower, where the lookout post stood. Thomas climbed the narrow spiral staircase, each step worn smooth by countless feet over the decades. Reaching the top, he gazed across the horizon. The village below slumbered. The fields stretched dark and still, and the distant forest rustled softly in the breeze. He knew that tomorrow, the same morning routines would resume: inspection of the well, the granary, and the gates. But tonight was the canvas for observation, a time to notice what the daylight might conceal. Returning along the ramparts, Thomas paused at a small arrow slit. He tested the ancient mechanism for the drawbridge gate, ensuring its rope and pulley were in order. The wind tugged at his cloak, and the sound of it snapping against the stone reminded him of the castle's age. Centuries of weather, siege, and neglect survived through maintenance, vigilance, and human attention. His life, though monotonous to an outsider, was deeply intertwined with the preservation of all that stood before him. Finally, Thomas descended to his chamber. The quiet of the night enveloped him, a soft counterpoint to the stone-cold walls and endless duties. He removed his cloak, laid out his gear for inspection, and methodically cleaned his halberd, ensuring the blade remained sharp and free of rust. The simple, repetitive task had a meditative quality, allowing him to review the day's observations in his mind. He considered the minor repairs, the movements of the village, the behaviors of the animals, and the young guards he had guided. Each small act was part of a greater network of survival, unseen but essential. As he lay down, the soft rustle of the night accompanied him, the occasional owl's hoot, the murmur of the river in the distance, the whispering wind brushing against the battlements. Thomas closed his eyes, letting the cadence of the castle lull him toward rest, knowing that when dawn arrived, the rhythm of duty, quiet observation, and careful maintenance would resume without fail. It was a life of patience, attentiveness, and subtle triumphs. And though few outside these walls would ever notice, Thomas found fulfillment in its constancy. Morning light filtered through the narrow arrow slits of the central tower, painting thin golden streaks on the cold stone floor. Thomas stirred awake, stretching his arms and listening to the castle slowly come alive. The distant crow of roosters echoed from the village below, mingling with the faint clatter of pots from the kitchen. His night's vigilance had left him weary, yet he welcomed the routine of another day. It brought purpose and structure to a life that outsiders might call dull. He rose from his bed, pulling on his worn tunic and leggings, and carefully inspected his halberd once more. Its polished blade reflected the early sunlight, a reminder that even the smallest details mattered. Slipping into his leather boots, Thomas stepped out of his chamber and descended the spiral staircase, his boots thudding softly against the worn stone steps. The corridors were quiet, but familiar, each shadow and nook carrying the memory of decades, perhaps centuries, of activity within these walls. Reaching the main courtyard, he found the cook tending to the morning fire and preparing the first meals for the day. The smell of porridge and fresh bread filled the air, mixing with the faint tang of damp stone. Thomas nodded a greeting, acknowledging the cook's silent dedication. It was a minor exchange, but one that connected him to the rhythm of the castle's life. Every person, no matter how small their role seemed, contributed to the stability and safety of the fortress. His first task of the morning was to inspect the gatehouse. The massive wooden doors had weathered the night well, and the iron fittings gleamed faintly under the rising sun. Thomas tested the latch and checked the pulleys for the portcullis. Everything was in order, yet he made a mental note to oil the hinges before the week's end. Vigilance, he reminded himself, was not just about observing threats, but maintaining the structure that made defense possible. Next came the granary, a vital store of the castle's food. Thomas inspected the barrels of grain, ensuring they were dry and free from vermin. He lifted a sack and sniffed its contents, satisfied with its freshness. Even the smallest sign of rot or contamination could have disastrous consequences during the long winters, when the castle's walls would be closed to visitors and the village supplies dwindled. Careful maintenance and routine inspection were as essential to survival as the watch over the battlements. The day continued with a tour of the outer walls. Thomas moved deliberately, checking each sentry post and speaking quietly with the younger guards. One apprentice, expressed concern over a loose stone near the northern tower, and Thomas examined it carefully. Indeed, a slight crack had formed along its edge. He marked it in his mental ledger, knowing that a mason would need to reinforce it before it could worsen. Even in moments that seemed insignificant, the guard's decisions shaped the castle's future safety. By mid-morning, Thomas returned to the courtyard. He observed the village below, farmers tending their plots, children weaving between carts and livestock, a blacksmith hammering steadily at the forge. From his vantage point, the castle walls became a lens for understanding the larger world, the delicate balance between human effort and the unpredictable nature surrounding them. The guard's life was quiet, yes, but it demanded acute attention and constant adaptation. After a brief pause to sip water from his leather flask, Thomas inspected the castle well, testing the pulley and bucket system. Clean water was a lifeline. Any failure could jeopardize the inhabitants during times of siege or scarcity. Each small inspection felt repetitive, yet it carried immense weight. The castle was a network of interdependent functions, and Thomas's careful eyes ensured that every piece worked harmoniously. As the sun climbed higher, Thomas made his way back to the armory. He checked the weapons stored for emergencies: bows, arrows, halberds, and swords. Polishing a blade, he reflected on the unusual peace that had descended upon this part of the countryside. There were no armies approaching, no intruders spotted during the night. And yet, he understood that peace was fragile. The guard's life existed in this tension between routine and the latent possibility of chaos. Lunch was simple: bread, cheese, and a few dried fruits. Thomas ate alone in the quiet courtyard, savoring the momentary stillness. The castle, for all its stone and timber, thrummed with life through human diligence. In these small routines, he found rhythm, purpose, and even a subtle satisfaction that outsiders would rarely comprehend. It was a life built on the invisible victories of foresight, care, and patience. The afternoon loomed with more inspections, storerooms, battlements, and watch points along the walls. Every step, every glance, every minor adjustment reinforced the castle's resilience. The hours passed in near silence, punctuated by the occasional creak of timber, the distant chatter of villagers, and the occasional call from a young apprentice reporting a minor concern. Thomas's role was unglamorous, yet indispensable. In a world often romanticized for battles and heroism, the guard's quiet diligence kept history steady. As dusk approached, Thomas stood once more on the ramparts, gazing at the fatting sunlight over the fields. He noted the positions of the livestock, the signs of activity among the villagers, and the movement of shadows cast by the towers. In the quiet contemplation, he understood that even in what seemed mundane, there was a profound connection between observation, care, and the continued survival of all within the castle walls. Evening approached slowly, casting long shadows across the castle's stone courtyards. Thomas had completed the afternoon inspections, and now the castle seemed to exhale, as if settling into a quieter rhythm. The sun dipped behind the distant hills, turning the sky into a muted tapestry of orange and violet. From his post atop the battlements, Thomas observed the villagers returning home, their carts creaking under the weight of the day's harvest. The subtle smells of smoke from hearths, mingling with the earthy scent of freshly tilled soil, drifted upward, reminding him of the fragile harmony between the fortress and the community it protected. After ensuring the gates were secured and the portcullis mechanism lubricated for the night, Thomas made his way back to the armory. He carefully cleaned and stored the weapons he had checked earlier, noting any minor imperfections. A bowstring slightly frayed, a sword hilt worn, each small flaw recorded in his mental ledger, waiting for the castle smith to repair. These tasks were repetitive, yet each held significance. One overlooked detail could ripple into a catastrophe during times of threat. Vigilance was quiet, but relentless, a constant undercurrent of responsibility. The castle cook was preparing a modest evening meal, and the aroma of stewing vegetables and hearty bread filled the corridors. Thomas accepted a small portion and ate in near silence, appreciating the simplicity of the food. No feasts or ceremonies today, just nourishment to sustain him for another night's watch. He listened to the soft murmur of other guards discussing minor events, complaints about the weather, and the occasional jest, all blending into the ordinary soundtrack of castle life. These mundane interactions were the threads that wove the fabric of daily existence. After his meal, Thomas took a slow walk along the inner walls, inspecting the torches and oil lamps that would provide light once darkness fully claimed the sky. Each torch had to be filled, each wick trimmed. Even such small acts carried weight, for without light, the castle became vulnerable, blind in the quiet night. He passed the stables, checking that horses were properly fed and tethered, ears flicking at the sound of his steps, the gentle whinny of a mare, the shuffle of hooves on stone. These familiar sounds brought a small comfort, a reminder that life, even routine life, was alive and enduring. As twilight deepened, Thomas climbed to the highest tower. From this vantage point, the surrounding forest and fields stretched endlessly, painted in deepening blues and shadows. He adjusted his cloak against the chill creeping through the air and scanned the horizon. There were no distant riders, no signs of trouble, only the serene, unbroken countryside. Yet, he remained alert. The history of the realm had taught him that peace was ephemeral. Each quiet night was both a gift and a responsibility, a time to rest the mind while keeping the senses sharp. Throughout the evening, he made rounds, passing each sentry post and speaking softly with the other guards. "All is secure," he would murmur, hearing the same reassurance repeated back. Yet, each repetition was necessary, a ritual reinforcing vigilance and order. The castle relied on these small, coordinated acts, the silent choreography of routine that kept its walls strong and its inhabitants safe. Thomas found a strange satisfaction in this monotony, a fulfillment rooted in the knowledge that his attention to detail preserved lives. By nightfall, the torches blazed along the walls, casting flickering shadows that danced across the stone. The castle transformed under their light, appearing both formidable and intimate. Thomas paused, leaning on the parapet, and listened to the night. The distant call of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the occasional bark from a village dog. In these quiet moments, he reflected on the day's work, the gates secured, the granary checked, the weapons polished, and understood that heroism did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered through diligence, patience, and quiet observation. Before retiring for the night, he made a final inspection of the inner keep. Every latch, door, and window was accounted for, each minor concern noted for tomorrow. Thomas allowed himself a brief moment to lean against the cool stone wall, closing his eyes, feeling the weight of the day sink into his bones. The castle was alive with unseen efforts, and he had contributed to its rhythm, its security, its enduring stability. Even a life that seemed ordinary to outsiders carried profound significance when lived with care and awareness. As he finally returned to his chamber, Thomas removed his boots and set them neatly beside his bed. The flickering torchlight cast shadows across the walls, and the castle, now fully immersed in darkness, seemed to breathe. He lay down, eyes tracing the rough ceiling beams, mind calm from the day's routines. Soon, the sounds of the night, the gentle wind, the soft stirrings of the castle lulled him toward sleep. Tomorrow would bring the same duties, the same inspections, and the same quiet satisfaction of a life lived in service, vigilance, and care. The night deepened, wrapping the castle in a velvet cloak of silence. Thomas rose from his bed, careful not to disturb the slumbering corridors, and donned his cloak once more. The torches along the hallways flickered weakly, shadows stretching and contracting with every gust of cold air seeping through narrow arrow slits. He moved quietly, the soft soles of his boots whispering against the worn stone floors. Midnight watch had begun, and while the castle appeared dormant, Thomas knew that vigilance never rested. He stepped onto the outer walls, where the moon cast pale silver light over the courtyard below. The scent of damp earth and distant smoke mingled, carrying faint echoes of the village that lay beyond the forested hills. Thomas adjusted his grip on the spear he carried, a simple yet essential extension of himself during these long, silent hours. He listened closely, attuning his senses to the subtle sounds of the night. A branch cracking under the weight of an animal, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the distant hoot of an owl. These ordinary noises held extraordinary importance. Each could be a harbinger of danger, or merely nature continuing its quiet existence. Rounding the northern tower, he noticed a faint shimmer of light reflecting on the horizon. Perhaps a traveler's lantern, or the moon catching a distant stream. Thomas observed without haste, recording the position and movement of the faint glow in his mind. Night demanded patience. Impulsivity could breed error. Vigilance thrived in quiet contemplation. The castle's stone walls, cold and unyielding, seemed almost alive under the stars, echoing centuries of unseen eyes that had once stood in similar posts, guardians of the same land. The inner courtyard remained empty, except for the occasional clatter of a rat disturbing a pile of old wood. Thomas's gaze swept across the granary, its sturdy doors locked and reinforced. The storage of food, often overlooked, was a matter of survival, especially during harsh winters when supply lines were uncertain. He inspected the locks briefly, satisfied with their resilience, before continuing along the battlements. His breath fogged in the crisp night air, and the quiet rhythm of his steps became meditative, a grounding in the repetitive yet essential tasks of castle defense. By the eastern wall, Thomas paused, observing the distant forest that bordered the castle lands. Shadows pooled between the trees, and moonlight danced on the uneven terrain, revealing subtle movements. He imagined the foxes, deer, and owls inhabiting this space, each living their own nocturnal lives. Occasionally, his imagination wandered to the possibility of less benign visitors, bandits, spies, or hostile forces. While the night was mostly peaceful, the memory of past skirmishes and local unrest reminded him that complacency could be dangerous. In these quiet hours, anticipation became a second nature, a companion as constant as the cold wind. Thomas descended to the lower walkways, checking the oil lamps lining the passages that connected towers. Each lamp had to burn steadily throughout the night. A sudden dark spot could provide cover for intruders. He ensured the wicks were trimmed and the oil reservoirs full, satisfied with the warm, flickering light spreading softly across the stone corridors. It was tedious work, but essential. In every routine, there existed the invisible threads that held the castle's defenses together. Thomas felt a quiet pride in his role, a satisfaction in the knowledge that his diligence kept both the fortress and its inhabitants safe. The castle keep was silent now, save for the creak of wooden beams and the occasional sigh of wind pressing against the walls. Thomas checked the barracks, where fellow guards slept fitfully, their breaths slow and steady. Even in rest, they were part of the castle's watch. Their readiness lay beneath the surface of sleep. Thomas returned briefly to the tower, climbing to the parapet to scan the land once more. The night stretched endlessly in all directions, serene and deceptively calm. Stars dotted the sky, each one a silent witness to the centuries of guardianship and vigilance unfolding beneath them. As the hours passed, Thomas reflected on the quiet heroism embedded in these routines. The world outside imagined knights, battles, and grand adventures. But here, in these shadows, the real acts of protection occurred unnoticed. His spear rested against the parapet, his cloak fluttered lightly in the breeze, and his senses remained alert. The castle depended on moments like these, each step, each observation, each careful inspection, forming the invisible bulwark against disorder. Life here was monotonous to the untrained eye, but in its repetition lay the essence of endurance, responsibility, and subtle triumph. Finally, nearing the pre-dawn hours, Thomas returned to the inner keep. He checked once more that the gates were secure, and that every door, every shutter, every lamp was exactly as it should be. The castle breathed around him, a living structure composed of stone, fire, and human diligence. Thomas allowed himself a moment to lean against the cool wall, closing his eyes to savor the stillness, knowing that the rhythm of the night was nearly complete. Soon a new day would emerge, and with it, the unchanging, vital routines that defined his life as a guardian. In these quiet hours, he had witnessed the invisible heartbeat of the castle, a testament to the unseen labor that sustained it. Dawn crept slowly over the horizon, painting the sky with faint hues of rose and amber. Thomas lingered on the battlements, watching as the first streaks of sunlight touched the cold stone walls. The long hours of the night watch were behind him, yet a new set of tasks awaited. The castle had its own rhythm, dictated by the rising sun, and Thomas had long learned to follow it with unwavering attention. Every day began with preparation, inspection, and quiet observation, a sequence that seemed monotonous to outsiders, but was essential for the fortress's survival. He descended from the tower stairs, the worn stone steps familiar under his careful tread. Servants and stable hands had already begun their early chores, moving with measured urgency across the courtyard. The scent of wood, smoke from small hearths, mingled with the fresh dew on the grass, creating a strangely comforting perfume of domesticity and labor. Thomas observed the activity, noting the movements of each individual. Even routine tasks could conceal hazards if left unchecked. Nothing, he had learned, was too small to escape a careful eye. By the granary, he checked the stockpiles of grain and dried foods. Last night's inspection had ensured the locks were secure, but the early morning light revealed further details: slight dampness along the edges of a sack, the scuff marks of small animals testing the perimeter. He adjusted a few bundles, moved others to prevent crushing, and made mental notes of what would require more thorough attention during the next evening's rounds. Vigilance was not confined to night. It extended into every corner of the castle, even when it appeared lifeless or idle. The courtyard filled with the sounds of awakening, clanging buckets, the chatter of cooks preparing for the morning meal, the lowing of livestock being guided into pens. Thomas took a moment to watch the daily life unfold, noticing the seamless choreography of hands and animals moving in concert. Each participant, whether servant, guard, or craftsman, contributed to the living organism that was the castle. From a distance, the scene seemed ordinary, yet every motion played a part in a grand design that protected, nourished, and sustained those within. Ascending once again to the higher walls, Thomas began his morning patrol. Sunlight now illuminated the surrounding fields, revealing farmers beginning their work, carts moving slowly along dirt roads, and distant plumes of smoke marking the boundaries of nearby homesteads. The forest beyond remained a shadowy frontier, full of unseen life and potential dangers. Thomas's eyes scanned the horizon continuously, following the subtle shifts in the landscape, noting anything unusual, a missing fence post, an unlit path, or the presence of strangers in the distance. Knowledge of these details, collected slowly over months and years, formed a mental map he could rely upon in times of crisis. The castle gates were the next focus of his attention. He ensured the heavy wooden doors were secured, and that hinges, chains, and bolts were all functioning properly. Though it had been decades since an actual siege threatened this fortress, the discipline of preparedness never relaxed. Thomas had learned that small lapses could lead to large consequences. A single overlooked detail might allow a thief, a spy, or a bandit to breach the perimeter. Each inspection was an exercise in precision, an unspoken contract with the centuries of guardians who had come before him. At midday, Thomas joined a small group of fellow guards to rotate positions and share observations. They exchanged quiet reports of unusual sounds, minor repairs needed, and movements spotted in the surrounding fields. Though the conversation was brief, it served as a crucial link between individual observations and collective knowledge. The castle's defense relied not only on the physical strength of its walls, but on the attentive minds of those who occupied them. Thomas listened carefully, adding his own insights, silently recognizing that each exchange could prevent future misfortune. By late afternoon, the sun hung high, casting sharp shadows across the courtyard. Thomas returned to the outer walls for a final round before the evening chores would begin. He observed the villagers beyond the castle limits tending their crops, washing clothes in the stream, and guiding livestock homeward. Life continued in its steady, predictable rhythm. Yet Thomas knew that the peace could shift in an instant. The patterns he had memorized, the precise positions of animals, the familiar paths of travelers, the locations of hidden tracks in the woods, formed a protective latticework that few would ever notice, but all depended upon. As the evening approached, Thomas allowed himself a moment to rest on the parapet, feeling the warmth of the setting sun on his back. He reflected on the continuity of these daily routines, the repetition that outsiders might call tedious, but which contained the essence of security, resilience, and subtle heroism. The castle's stones absorbed centuries of such moments, each one a testament to the unseen labor that kept this fortress and its people alive and safe. Soon, night would fall again, and Thomas would resume his vigil, carrying forward the long chain of guardianship that stretched across generations. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, casting long, dappled shadows across the castle courtyard. Thomas moved along the ramparts with a steady pace, alert to every sound, the distant crow of a rooster, the occasional bark of a dog, and the rhythmic creaking of wooden carts on the outer roads. Though the day had begun predictably, he knew that no routine lasted forever. Each moment, each glance, could reveal something out of place, a clue to a problem before it became a threat. Below, the castle courtyard was alive with activity. Cooks carried trays of fresh bread and porridge, their hands and arms deft from years of practice. Servants hurried between kitchens, storehouses, and the stables, often with barely a pause. Thomas noted the subtle cues of movement: a horse shifting nervously, a shadow flitting near a granary, a group of workers pausing too long in one spot. Nothing escaped his attention, for years of training had taught him to notice not only the obvious, but also the small, telling irregularities of daily life. By mid-afternoon, Thomas was assigned to inspect the armory. The heavy doors groaned as he pushed them open, and the familiar scent of oiled metal, leather, and wood enveloped him. Rows of swords, axes, and crossbows lined the walls, each piece carefully maintained and ready for use. He checked the bindings of the shields, the tautness of bowstrings, and the alignment of pikes and halberds. Every item had a story, from weapons used in minor skirmishes to relics of past conflicts long forgotten. To an outsider, this might seem like busy work, but for Thomas, the armory was a critical node in the web of security that kept the castle intact. Outside the armory, the stables beckoned. The low whinnies and the soft snorts of horses filled the air as stable hands guided them into shaded pens. Thomas inspected the gates, checked feed troughs, and ensured that no animals had wandered too far. Horses were not merely beasts of burden, they were a crucial lifeline, capable of carrying messages, supplies, and even mounted soldiers in times of need. Maintaining their health and containment was as vital as securing any door or wall. As he moved back toward the outer walls, Thomas paused to observe the village fields beyond. Farmers were in the thick of harvest, moving rhythmically through rows of grain and vegetables. Children ran along the edge of the forest, laughing, chasing each other, oblivious to the careful eyes watching from above. The contrast between the simplicity of daily labor and the unseen vigilance required for security fascinated Thomas. Peace was never merely granted. It was cultivated, maintained through small, constant acts of observation and intervention. Toward late afternoon, Thomas met briefly with the master of the castle kitchens to coordinate food deliveries for the guards during the night watch. The discussion was precise and methodical: who received which portions, when meals would be delivered, and how to manage the firewood supply. It might have seemed trivial to outsiders, yet the efficiency of these arrangements ensured that those on the night watch would remain alert and nourished. Thomas appreciated these small interlocking systems, each part essential to the whole. As the sun dipped lower, Thomas returned to the battlements for his final patrol of the day. Shadows stretched across the walls, and the distant village smoke curled lazily into the cooling air. The forest beyond remained a dark, shifting silhouette, hiding both harmless creatures and potential threats. Thomas's eyes scanned every tree line, every path, every shadow. He noted the positions of hunters, travelers, and villagers alike, mentally cataloging patterns that would inform future rounds. The work was quiet almost meditative, but it was never without purpose. Nightfall approached, bringing a cool breeze that rustled the banners atop the towers. Thomas took a moment to reflect on the day. Though unremarkable in the eyes of most, the hours had been filled with observation, subtle interventions, and countless small acts of responsibility. In each of these moments lay the invisible labor that sustained life within the castle walls. One might call it boring, yet it was foundational, a steady rhythm of survival, vigilance, and care. As darkness settled over the land, Thomas prepared himself for another night watch, ready to continue the silent, uncelebrated work that had defined his life. The first stars had begun to prick the night sky when Thomas took his position atop the battlements, the cold stone pressing against his boots. A thin mist had begun to settle in the courtyard below, softening the edges of torches and lanterns. The castle seemed quieter now, yet no less demanding. Each shadow could conceal movement. Each rustle of the trees could signal approaching danger. Thomas's senses sharpened. The rhythm of his patrol was steady, disciplined, and almost instinctive. From his vantage point, he could see the village beyond the fields, now largely asleep. Occasional lanterns flickered in windows, signaling those still awake. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, startling a fox that darted into the trees. Thomas noted it, but there was nothing threatening. Still, vigilance required that he record every anomaly, every subtle shift in the nocturnal landscape. The night might be quiet, but the quiet was deceptive. Suddenly, a sound caught his attention, a low, scraping noise from the direction of the outer gate. Thomas crouched low, his eyes narrowing. The sound repeated, slower this time, deliberate, almost mechanical. It was too rhythmic to be an animal. He strained to hear over the whispering wind, calculating distance and direction. A shadow moved, gliding across the courtyard toward the gate. Instinctively, Thomas reached for his spear and shifted his stance, ready to intervene. He descended the spiral stairs to the gatehouse, moving silently, careful not to alert anyone unnecessarily. From the parapet, he could see a lone figure fiddling with the lock. It was a peasant from the nearby village, perhaps driven by curiosity or a need for supplies. Thomas did not hesitate, he called out softly, his voice carrying authority. "Who goes there? State your purpose." The figure froze, then lifted his hands in surrender. Relief and caution mingled in Thomas's mind. The threat was minor, but even small breaches could escalate if ignored. After ensuring the peasant was safely returned to the village, Thomas resumed his patrol. His boots clicked against the stone as he moved toward the towers, scanning the forest line for signs of nocturnal predators. Owls hooted from the trees, and small creatures rustled through the underbrush. Each sound, each movement, had to be catalogued in his mind. The night demanded constant awareness. Even the slightest lapse could be catastrophic, not just for him, but for everyone within the castle walls. Halfway through his round, Thomas checked the signal towers. He ran his hands over the ropes and pulleys, ensuring the fire beacons could be lit in an emergency. These towers were silent witnesses to centuries of vigilance. Their purpose was simple, yet essential: He ran his fingers over the wood and iron fittings, nodding wear and tear, considering when repairs might be needed. Such foresight prevented crises before they occurred. Thomas had learned that preventative vigilance was the cornerstone of castle security. Toward midnight, a breeze shifted, carrying the scent of smoke from the distant chimneys. The warmth of home and hearth reminded him that while the castle seemed isolated, life thrived within and beyond its walls. The night watch was lonely, but it was also a bridge between the routine of the day and the uncertainty of the coming hours. Thomas paused, taking a slow breath, appreciating the delicate balance of quiet and vigilance that defined his existence. As the night deepened, Thomas returned to the inner courtyard to check on the guards stationed along the outer walls. They nodded in acknowledgement, sharing the unspoken camaraderie of those who understood the silent responsibilities of protection. Thomas moved among them, offering guidance, checking alertness, and nodding minor adjustments. Each guard was part of the larger rhythm, a human link in the chain that preserved order, safety, and continuity within the fortress. By the time the moon reached its apex, Thomas's patrol was complete. He returned to the central tower, exhaustion pressing against his limbs. Yet, there was no sense of completion, only continuity. Tomorrow would bring a new day of observations, small interventions, and quiet responsibility. For Thomas, this unheralded work was life itself, a life marked not by heroics, but by persistent care, vigilance, and the invisible labor that allowed the castle, its inhabitants, and the surrounding village to exist in peace. Episode 16. Dawn broke slowly over the horizon, painting the sky in muted shades of rose and gold. Thomas had already been awake for hours, listening to the faint sounds of the castle stirring from slumber. The night had passed without incident, but the morning brought its own subtle challenges. Birds called to each other from the towers, and the distant crowing of roosters signaled the awakening of the village. Thomas stepped out onto the battlements, letting the cool air fill his lungs. The stones beneath his feet, still damp from the night mist. The castle gates creaked open, and peasants began to move about their routines. He watched as carts laden with goods rolled in from the village, and servants hurried to their morning chores. Every small movement, every routine, mattered to the life of the fortress. Thomas walked along the ramparts, scanning the surrounding fields for any unusual activity. Even in daylight, vigilance was required. The quiet could deceive, and the world beyond the walls was never entirely predictable. At the northern wall, Thomas encountered a group of guards preparing for the morning inspection. He nodded, acknowledging their readiness, and moved along to check the supply storerooms. Here, the work was meticulous. Barrels of grain, sacks of flour, and dried meats had to be accounted for, inspected for pests or spoilage. The castle's survival depended on these small yet essential tasks. Thomas noted a minor gap in one of the sacks, where a rat had nibbled through the cloth. It was a trivial damage, but it could not be ignored. Moving to the archery range, Thomas watched the younger guards practice their aim. Arrows whistled through the air, striking the wooden targets with varying precision. He offered pointers, demonstrating proper stance and focus. Even the simplest gestures mattered. In a real confrontation, every skill could be the difference between safety and disaster. Thomas found satisfaction in these quiet teachings. The work might seem monotonous, but it built resilience and confidence, brick by brick. A sudden clatter drew his attention to the outer courtyard. A cart had tipped over, spilling vegetables across the cobblestones. Thomas hurried to assist, coordinating the peasants and guards to clear the mess quickly. It was a mundane task, yet essential. Efficiency and order in small matters often prevented larger chaos. He worked alongside them silently, his movements deliberate, a silent reminder of leadership through example. By mid-morning, the castle was fully alive. Kitchens burned with fires for bread and stew. The blacksmith's hammer rang in the forge, and the sound of children playing reached the walls from the village nearby. Thomas took a moment to observe from the highest tower, appreciating the quiet interconnectedness of all the lives dependent on the fortress. Each individual, from the lowliest servant to the most skilled craftsman, contributed to the unseen balance that preserved safety and stability. The midday sun climbed higher, warming the stone walls. Thomas joined the guards for their routine drills. Swords clashed, and shields thudded in the training yard, a symphony of discipline and precision. He watched carefully, noting weaknesses and strengths, ensuring each guard was prepared for unforeseen challenges. The drills were rigorous, but necessary, reinforcing not just skill, but trust in one another. As the day wore on, Thomas wandered along the inner corridors, checking on the storerooms, the armory, and the watch posts. Everything needed attention: polished weapons, repaired armor, and cleaned lookout points. Time and care were invested in these tasks, yet the reward was invisible. A well-maintained castle rarely faced crisis, but the quiet diligence of its guards ensured that when challenges arose, they could be met calmly and effectively. By late afternoon, Thomas finally paused at the central courtyard, watching the shadows lengthen across the stone. He felt a familiar fatigue pressing on his shoulders, but also a quiet pride. The day had passed without major incident, yet he knew that the small acts of vigilance, guidance, and observation were what kept the castle alive and its people secure. For Thomas, these were the unheralded victories, the true measure of a life devoted to quiet service. The night had settled over the castle, leaving only the soft glow of torchlight along the walls to guide Thomas as he walked the battlements. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant river, and the sounds of the courtyard had faded into a hushed rhythm. Thomas had just handed over his post to the evening guard, yet the responsibility lingered in his mind. Even off duty, he could not help but notice the slightest movements, the subtle signs that might indicate trouble, or simply another ordinary moment in the life of the castle. He descended the spiral staircase leading to his small chamber, the stone steps cold beneath his boots. As he entered, he saw the flickering candlelight illuminate the simple furnishings: a wooden bench, a straw mattress, and a few personal belongings carefully arranged. Thomas sat down, letting out a long breath, and reflected on the day's events. The traveler who had arrived at dawn had stirred a quiet curiosity, and the steward's questions hinted at possible unrest in the northern villages. But nothing had happened yet. All that remained was waiting, as it always did. Later, as Thomas lay on his straw bed, he thought about the other people who called the castle home. The cook, who worked tirelessly to prepare meals for 100 people; the blacksmith, whose hammering could be heard throughout the day; the maids and servants, moving in almost invisible patterns to ensure the castle functioned smoothly. Their lives intersected with his in small ways. He had seen the cook glance up from the kitchen to the gate where the traveler entered, had noticed the blacksmith pause mid-strike to watch the battlements. But no one truly realized the network of dependencies that held the castle together. Thomas understood it all: the way each small action mattered in a system bigger than himself. Morning came quietly, with a pale light filtering through the arrow slits. Thomas rose, pulling on his cloak, and made his way to the top of the walls. Today, he thought, might bring news, or it might bring nothing at all. Either way, the watch must continue. He could see the fields stretching outward, the village beyond the river, and the distant forest line where hunters would be setting out to track game. A faint breeze carried the smell of wet soil and smoke from the hearths below. Life was slow, measured, and meticulously ordinary. But within that ordinariness lay the hidden pulse of history. By mid-morning, a group of villagers approached, carrying baskets of vegetables and eggs. Thomas greeted them, checking their intentions with the practiced calm of someone who had spent years observing without interference. The villagers were respectful, bowing slightly as they passed through the gate, offering news of the local harvest and minor disputes that Thomas noted silently. Each detail might seem trivial, but to the Lord and his stewards, these small insights formed the fabric of the region's stability. A castle was not merely a fortification. It was a center of information, a hub for trade, governance, and protection. And the guard, unseen and often unacknowledged, was its first line of awareness. By noon, Thomas had resumed his patrols along the parapet. The sun was high, warming the stone and illuminating the distant hills. He watched as a hawk swooped across the fields, a reminder that even in quiet moments, life went on in ways both ordinary and extraordinary. The small details mattered: the tilt of a flag signaling wind direction, the sound of hooves on the far road indicating travelers approaching, the subtle movements of leaves in the forest revealing the passage of animals or people. Each observation added to the quiet accumulation of knowledge that kept the castle alive. Afternoon brought the steward and the lord's scribe to the battlements. They carried parchment and ink, asking Thomas questions about the visitors and the timing of their arrival. He answered carefully, reporting what he had seen without embellishment. The steward nodded appreciatively, scribbling notes that would eventually reach the Lord. It was a small acknowledgement, yet in that moment, Thomas felt a quiet pride. His work might be invisible to many, but it mattered. The ordinary life of a guard, full of patience, attention, and vigilance, was what maintained order in a world often described only through tales of heroism or battle. As the evening approached, Thomas watched the sun dip behind the western hills. The sky turned soft shades of amber and rose, casting long shadows over the courtyard. The gates closed once more, and the castle settled into its nightly routine. Thomas took one last round of the walls, listening to the faint sounds of the village, the occasional bark of a dog, and the whispering wind. Every sound, every movement, contributed to the rhythm of the castle's life. Finally, he returned to his quarters, removing his boots and loosening his cloak. Sitting by the candlelight, he thought of the quiet dignity in the mundane, the food prepared, the messages delivered, the gates watched, the stones patrolled. History, he realized, was not only made in battles or grand speeches, but in these small, deliberate acts performed by people like him. The ordinary moments, repeated day after day, were the true foundation of a functioning world. Night fully descended, and Thomas lay on his bed, listening to the castle breathing around him. Tomorrow would be much like today, a continuation of observation, care, and quiet service. Yet, even in this repetitive rhythm, there was meaning. For though the stories of kings and knights might dominate the annals of history, it was the unnoticed efforts of ordinary people that kept life steady, safe, and alive. Thomas closed his eyes, letting sleep envelop him, knowing that his vigilance, his patience, and his attention to the small details were the invisible threads holding the castle and the lives within it together.